There is a misconception that empaths are weak. People often assume that because an empath is patient, understanding, forgiving, and willing to see the good in others, they can be pushed endlessly without consequence. They mistake compassion for a lack of boundaries. They mistake kindness for compliance. They mistake silence for surrender. That misunderstanding costs people relationships every single day. An empath will often give more chances than most people believe are reasonable. They will listen when others are tired of listening. They will stay when others have already walked away. They will search for explanations when everyone else is looking for excuses. They will invest emotional energy into understanding pain, trauma, fear, insecurity, and human imperfection. But there is something most people never see. Every disappointment is recorded, not in a notebook, not in a secret file, but in a growing awareness. An empath notices patterns. They notice the promise that was never kept, the apology that was repeated but never followed by change, the conversation that always circles back to the same disrespect, the effort that only travels in one direction, the support that is expected but never returned. They notice all of it, and while they may remain quiet, do not confuse that quietness with blindness. The empath sees more than they say, far more. The reason many people are shocked when an empath leaves is because they mistake tolerance for acceptance. Those are not the same thing. An empath may tolerate behavior while they gather information. They may tolerate mistakes because they understand that everyone makes them. They may tolerate difficult seasons because life is complicated, but acceptance is different. Acceptance means a behavior becomes part of the relationship. Acceptance means the standard has changed. Acceptance means the damage has become normal. And that is where many people make their biggest mistake. They assume the empath has accepted what they have merely tolerated. The empath continues giving, continues listening, continues supporting, continues caring. Meanwhile, the other person becomes increasingly comfortable. They stop appreciating, they stop noticing, they stop reciprocating, and eventually they stop trying. This is where the invisible countdown begins, because empaths rarely leave after a single event. They leave after a pattern repeated enough times that it reveals the truth. Not the truth someone speaks, the truth someone lives. Words rarely drive an empath away. Parts do. An empath can forgive a bad day. They can forgive stress. They can forgive mistakes. What becomes difficult to forgive is a consistent demonstration that their feelings matter less than someone else's convenience. That realization changes everything. The most dangerous thing you can do to an empath is make them feel unseen, not disagreed with, not challenged, unseen. When someone feels unseen, they question a conversation. When an empath feels unseen, they question the entire relationship, because connection is everything to them. Genuine connection, authentic connection, mutual connection. Without that, the relationship slowly becomes an emotional transaction. And empaths eventually recognize transactions. They recognize when they are constantly giving emotional support while receiving emotional neglect. They recognize when they are carrying responsibilities that belong to someone else. They recognize when they are being valued only for what they provide rather than who they are. The moment that recognition becomes undeniable, something shifts, not outwardly. Internally, the empath stops trying to convince, stops explaining, stops arguing, stops chasing understanding. Many people miss this stage completely. They assume everything is fine because the conflict has disappeared, but the conflict has not disappeared. The empath has simply stopped investing energy into a battle they no longer believe can be won. And that is often the beginning of the end. People expect departures to be dramatic. They expect shouting, arguments, ultimatums, doors slamming. But when an empath finally reaches their limit, the exit is often quiet. Quiet because the emotional processing has already happened. Quiet because the grief has already been experienced. Quiet because the decision was made long before it became visible. By the time others notice the distance, the empath has usually spent months wrestling with the reality of the situation, months questioning themselves, months giving opportunities, months hoping things would change, months searching for evidence that the relationship could still become healthy. When that evidence never arrives, acceptance takes its place. And acceptance is powerful because once an empath accepts reality, they stop negotiating with fantasy. They stop falling in love with potential. They stop investing in promises. They stop waiting for transformation. They begin responding to what is, not what could be. That is a turning point few relationships survive. The greatest mistake people make is believing an empath's loyalty is unconditional. It is not. Their love may be deep. Their patience may be extraordinary. Their understanding may seem endless, but loyalty requires respect. Without respect, loyalty eventually collapses. Respect is the foundation that keeps emotional connection alive. Without it, every interaction becomes erosion, tiny pieces disappearing over time. Trust disappears, safety disappears, admiration disappears, hope disappears, and when enough disappears, the empath disappears too. Not because they stopped caring. Often they care deeply, sometimes more deeply than ever. But caring is not enough to sustain a relationship that continuously causes harm. At some point, self-respect must become stronger than attachment. That moment changes lives because the empath who finally chooses themselves becomes almost impossible to manipulate. The guilt stops working. The pressure stops working. The emotional traps stop working. The promises stop working, not because they became cold, because they became clear. Clarity is what makes an empath powerful. Once clarity arrives, confusion loses its influence. The empath no longer asks whether they deserve better. They know they do. They no longer wonder whether they are asking for too much. They understand they were often asking for the bare minimum: honesty, respect, consistency, effort, reciprocity. The essentials of human connection, nothing extraordinary, just real. And when someone repeatedly refuses to provide those essentials, the empath eventually reaches a conclusion that changes everything. If I must constantly abandon myself to keep this relationship, then this relationship costs too much. That realization creates distance, not out of anger, out of wisdom. The empath begins protecting energy instead of sacrificing it, protecting peace instead of proving loyalty, protecting mental health instead of preserving appearances. And once that shift occurs, the relationship enters dangerous territory because people who benefited from unlimited access rarely respond well to boundaries. The moment the empath says no, they are accused of changing. The moment they protect themselves, they are accused of becoming selfish. The moment they stop overextending themselves, they are accused of not caring. But the truth is simple. Boundaries do not destroy healthy relationships. They reveal unhealthy ones. And revelation is uncomfortable for those who were benefiting from imbalance. The empath understands this eventually. They understand that not everyone who wants access deserves access. Not everyone who asks for understanding offers understanding. Not everyone who requests loyalty provides loyalty. And once they learn that lesson, their standards rise, not because they think they are better than others, because they finally recognize their own value. Value changes behavior. A person who does not recognize their value tolerates what should never be tolerated. A person who recognizes their value becomes selective, intentional, protective, aware. That awareness is why the empath eventually walks away. Not because they stopped loving, because they started valuing themselves. The tragedy is that many people only recognize an empath's value after the empath is gone, after the calls stop, after the messages stop, after the support disappears, after the emotional safety they took for granted no longer exists. Then the realization arrives, then they understand, then they see what was standing in front of them all along. But by then, it may be too late. Because one of the most misunderstood truths about empaths is this: they can endure almost anything for a period of time: disrespect, neglect, disappointment, broken promises, emotional imbalance. But once they are truly done, they are done, not impulsively, not emotionally, decisively. The same depth that allowed them to stay so long gives them the strength to leave permanently. They do not disappear because they are weak. They disappear because they finally understand that their presence is valuable. And valuable things are not meant to be wasted. So, if there is one thing that will cause an empath to disappear from your life, it is this. Make them feel consistently unimportant. Make them feel consistently unheard. Make them feel consistently unappreciated. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly, because every repetition sends the same message. And eventually they believe it. The moment they believe they are not valued, they stop fighting to remain where they are merely tolerated. And when they leave, they often leave quietly. No grand speech, no dramatic exit. Just absence, the kind of absence that reveals everything their presence was providing. And that is when many people learn a lesson they should have learned much earlier. The people who give the most are often the ones you cannot afford to lose. Part 2. Most people never realize the exact moment an empath begins to detach. They imagine there is some dramatic event, some explosive argument, some unforgettable betrayal that instantly changes everything. But that is rarely how it happens. The process is much quieter than that. It begins with observation. It begins with awareness. It begins with the empath noticing something they have noticed before and before and before again. Partals, human beings reveal themselves through patterns. Anyone can be kind once. Anyone can be patient once. Anyone can be generous once. Anyone can say the right words once. But patterns reveal character. Consistency reveals truth. And empaths are experts at reading consistency, not because they possess magical abilities, not because they have special powers, but because they pay attention to emotional details that others often ignore. They notice tone changes. They notice energy shifts. They notice contradictions. They notice what people say and compare it to what people do. Most importantly, they notice when effort becomes one-sided. That is where many relationships begin their slow collapse. At first, the imbalance seems small. One person is busy, one person is stressed, one person is struggling. The empath understands, the empath adjusts, the empath compensates, the empath gives a little more. And because they care deeply, that extra effort feels natural. It feels temporary. It feels necessary. But then something happens. The temporary becomes permanent. The exception becomes the rule. The imbalance becomes the relationship. Now, the empath is carrying conversations, carrying emotional labor, carrying responsibility, carrying understanding, carrying patience, carrying forgiveness, carrying hope, while the other person contributes less and less. What many people fail to understand is that empaths are not exhausted by giving. They are exhausted by giving without reciprocity. There is a difference. An empath can invest tremendous amounts of energy into someone they love. What drains them is feeling that their investment disappears into a void. No appreciation, no acknowledgement, no effort to meet them halfway. Eventually, the empath begins asking silent questions. Questions they may never speak aloud. Questions that echo through their mind late at night. Would this person support me the way I support them? Would this person fight for me the way I fight for them? Would this person show up for me the way I show up for them? Would this person notice if I stopped giving? These questions matter because the answers determine the future of the relationship. And once an empath starts asking those questions, they start evaluating reality differently. They stop focusing on intentions. They start focusing on outcomes. Conditions are comforting. Outcomes are revealing. Someone may intend to be supportive. Someone may intend to be loyal. Someone may intend to be present. But intentions do not build relationships. Doxpaxers do. An empath eventually reaches a point where intentions no longer satisfy them. They need evidence, not promises. Evidence, not explanations. Evidence, not potential evidence. And when evidence is absent long enough, trust begins to erode. Trust rarely disappears overnight. It disappears grain by grain. One disappointment, one broken commitment, one ignored conversation, one neglected need, one forgotten promise at a time. People often assume trust is destroyed by massive betrayals. Sometimes it is. But more often, trust dies from accumulation. The accumulation of moments that communicate a single message. You are not a priority. That message hurts an empath deeply not because they demand constant attention, not because they require perfection, but because they invest themselves fully. And when someone repeatedly demonstrates that the investment is not mutual, the empath begins withdrawing emotionally. The withdrawal is subtle. At first, nobody notices. The empath still smiles, still listens, still participates, still shows kindness. But internally, something has changed. They stop expecting. They stop hoping, they stop reaching. And that change is significant because hope is one of the strongest forces keeping relationships alive. Hope convinces people to stay. Hope convinces people to try again. Hope convinces people to wait a little longer, give one more chance, have one more conversation, offer one more opportunity. But when hope disappears, reality becomes impossible to ignore. Reality says what repeated behavior actually means. Reality says what priorities actually are. Reality says who is willing to change and who is merely willing to apologize. There is a huge difference between those two things. An apology without change becomes manipulation. Not always intentional manipulation, but manipulation nonetheless, because it creates the illusion of progress without requiring actual progress. Empaths recognize this eventually. At first, they believe the words, then they watch the behavior. Then they compare the two. When the comparison reveals a mismatch, the empath begins trusting actions more than language. That is a dangerous moment for anyone taking them for granted, because words lose their power. Excuses lose their power. Promises lose their power. Only behavior remains. And behavior is difficult to argue with. This is where many people become confused. They suddenly notice the empath pulling away. The empath is less available, less emotionally invested, less eager to engage. The person who ignored the warning signs now wonders what happened. What happened is simple. The empath finally accepted the information they had been receiving all along. People often think acceptance is emotional. In reality, acceptance is logical. Acceptance is recognizing reality exactly as it is, without fantasy, without wishful thinking, without denial. Acceptance says, this person keeps showing me who they are. Acceptance says this pattern keeps repeating. Acceptance says waiting longer will not magically create a different outcome. That realization can be heartbreaking, especially for someone who truly loves.